about a bit of pruning, mainly pruning apples, but we'll mention about pears as well. So we're going to need a good pair of loppers, we're going to need a pruning saw, and we're going to need a pair of secateurs. You can sterilize the tools. There's lots of obviously sanitation materials around at the moment. Something like an alcohol kind of based one to wipe over it would be good, just to stop any cross-contamination of apple canker or something like that. So let's just assume that you've got your apple tree and you've planted what we call a maiden. A maiden is a 1-year-old, and you can have a maiden with feathers. Now this isn't an apple tree, this is actually a poplar tree, but I've just put it here just to show you how you would prune it. So in that first sort of winter, what you would do with an apple tree, you're trying to create a nice goblet shape, a little bit like a rose. So you don't really want all this leader growing up, so it's the opposite of actually pruning standard trees. So what we'd do is we'd remove the leader, and you'd remove any sort of lower branches that you didn't want, leaving you 4 nicely evenly spaced shoots. So I would actually just prune those off. So in the first ear, a maiden, a lateral maiden, you'd cut the leader out. That would leave you with 4 nicely spaced out shoots. In the following year, what you would do then is you would cut these back to, I would suggest, an outward facing bud. And what you're doing is cutting them back. I'd cut them back to about, say, a half, at least a third anyway, to get some nice sort of shoots on it. So just above a bud, just angle it above a bud, and you'd have something like that in the second year. What would happen then? They would shoot, so you would get then a series of shoots on each of these, and they'd grow themselves, of course, so they'd be like that, but you'd have shoots. And then what you would do is on each of the shoots that are spaced out, say I'd got that, you would cut that back, and then the following year we're on to our normal pruning systems. Okay, so that's establishing a fruit tree. Now if you wanted it as sort of a half sort of bush tree, you'd cut it down to about 24 inches, or if you want a bit bigger, 30 inches or bigger still. So that's the establishment and the sort of shape you're looking for in an apple tree. So let's say a few years have passed and we're now on to this. It's amazing how time goes. And so what we've got here is a tree which, to be fair, has been pruned, and you've got your sort of goblet shape, so that's all good. And now we've got to prune it. Now when we're pruning any tree, you can do a bit of detective work, and with apples you have to do a bit of detective work, because you've got to know, is it what we call a spur bearer or is it a tip bearer? And so by looking at the plant, here we've got what we call a spur bearer. Now the spurs are short wrinkly bits off the stem, and the buds are much bigger. If we compare that, for example, with, I'm just going to cut this down to about 3 or 4 buds. If you look at a vegetative, or a bud that's going to grow into a leaf, it's much tinier, whereas the spurs, the fruit-bearing buds, are much bigger. Okay, so that's a spur-bearing tree that we've got here. So when it comes on to spur pruning, let's just elaborate on a bit of spur pruning. You can see here clearly that there's quite a long extension growth, and one method of pruning is using the spur pruning method, where you cut it back to 4 buds. It will then form, the bottom 2 will form 2 fruiting spurs. You can see by the size of the buds that those are fruiting spurs. And what we do then, we can cut it in the second ear back to the fruiting spurs, and then they'll develop into number 3, into good fruiting spurs. And you wouldn't want any more than 2 per spur, otherwise you'd chop through the middle, so you've only got 1 apple per spur, otherwise you'll end up with small apples. A lot of the trees are spur bearers, but we will find some that are tip bearers, like Irish peach or Worcester Perum. So in their case, the fruit is formed on the tip, on the ends. So think of it a bit like a buddleia or a shrub that flowers on the end. The fruit is on the end. So we need to establish that. Now with this one...
So it'll have those lumpy buds on the end as well then, Mike?
Yeah,
what you showed
right.
us.
Here's an example of a tip bearer. So just as Darren was saying that you can have multiple buds on the end of the stem, you can see here this is on the end, and this is Irish peach, could be Worcester persimmon or one of the other tip bearers, but you can see the fruit is right on the end, and you get a cluster of buds, and they're quite big buds which form this fruit. So that's an example of a tip bearer. So with those, you're doing not quite so much spur pruning, but some of the long laterals you can cut back to 4, and they will still form a fruit on the end of it. Okay, but the main leaders, you want to try and leave them in so that you get the fruit off them. So just be careful of that one. It's the same in pears. If you're doing pear pruning, we have pears like Williams Boncheriton. That also is a tip bearer. So just watch out for when you're pruning them. Bramley apple, of course, is a partial tip bearer, and it's like a discovery, very similar. So you might end up with fruit on the end, but you'll also end up with fruit on spurs. So that does a bit of both. So again, generally you'd probably be spur pruning, but leaving the tips in so that you get the fruit from that as well.
Now you can see on this one has had some fruit, and so you can always look where the fruit has been, and you know, you do get an odd bit of fruit on the end here with these spurs. So what we're going to do is have a look at 1 or 2 pruning techniques with this. So on this branch up here, what we'd be doing here, you see it's growing straight upright, and all that will do will grow fast because it gets the light and straight up. So what I would do with that is just prune it to 4 buds. Okay, so I'd prune it to an outward facing bud and prune it like that. Now what's going to happen is the bottom 2 buds will form fruit buds, and the top 2 will grow into vegetative leafy buds. Okay, and then the same again with this one. I'm just going to prune that back. And so that's a little bit of spur pruning, but generally we're looking for an outward facing bud. And we would just work our way around and do that on pretty much all of this. Okay, we just prune it to outward facing buds, and that would, you know, that would be fine. Now there is another type of pruning that we can use. So we've got spur bearing pruning, and we've got what's called renewal pruning. So in renewal, what you do, if you've got say a nice shoot like that you think is going to be good in ear 1, what you can do is that actually can be cut back to just about 1 inch above the base.
So in this case, you are renewing the branch every sort of so many years, just to sort of keep that nice, fresh, rejuvenated branch for fruit. So in the first ear, you might have a long piece, and that might be grown on. And then in the second ear, where the girdle scar is, where the new growth has come to it, you can prune it back to the girdle scar. And so then what will happen by pruning it back to the girdle scar, so it's just a wrinkly growth around the stem, you get these nice fruiting, nice big buds which will form fruit, and they'll do really well. But then what you do is you renew the whole branch by cutting it back to 1 inch, and then you start all over again. That one then grows into a long one, you let that grow on, you cut it back to the girdle scar, it bears fruit, and then you cut it back to 1 inch. So that's a regular kind of renewal pruning, so that you don't get branches that sort of burn out. And so some of that is quite a good technique when you're pruning either apples or pears or roses, that kind of thing.
So if we cut that above the base, then that would shoot back into this. And then what we do is, where we've got extension growth, you can cut it back, and it will form shoots on the lower part, and it will fruit. And then again, the following year, we're cutting it back to 1 inch. On some of these bigger shoots, you might actually find, you know, you can cut it back quite hard to sort of just an inch above the new ear's growth. Okay, so that's kind of renewal. So it isn't fruiting every year, it's fruiting sort of, you know, once every third or fourth year. So that's renewal pruning. So just looking around here, I can see a few sort of examples of things that we'd need to prune off. So if we just have a look at this, another type of pruning is what we call regulatory pruning. Now with regulatory, this is the general pruning, so keeping a nice open goblet shape. But where you've got something like this, it's too complicated, and that branch is going to grow into that branch, is going to cause trouble. They could end up rubbing against each other. So what we've got to do is simplify this. So in order to simplify it, in this case you've got that one's on the outside, that one's on the outside, so I would just remove this one and remove that one to simplify it.
So let's take a look at different methods of what we call regulatory pruning. You can see that on the left hand slide here that there are two suckers which are going to be below where the plant was either grafted or budded, and these are the old rootstock suckers, so you don't want them because they will take over the plant. So the best thing to do is to try and rip them off, pull them off. If you can't do that, obviously you're going to have to prune them off. So we want to get rid of them. We also want to get rid of any water shoots that are going straight up, that are in the middle of the tree, which will spoil the framework of the tree. So anything that's going straight up. There are occasions with apple trees that you can cut them back to 4 buds to encourage them to form spurs, but generally speaking, if it's in the middle of the plant growing straight up, we want to take those out. Take a good look at your tree and try and read the tree. And as you can see this one, if you're looking closely, you can see that there are parallel branches, and if we take that one out, for example, that will help a lot with space on the other two. Obviously check it's not diseased or anything like that. And the same on this one. You can see here there's crossing branches, so clearly there needs to be removal of either one or perhaps both of the branches to make sure that there's plenty of room and plenty of air circulation. Also look at the crotch angle. You can see on the right here, that's a good crotch angle. The vessels are good, nice open vessels. But unfortunately, the crotch angle on the second one is so tight that it bunches up, and you can get a downgrowth on the diagonal, which means the branch can shed away on a very windy day. Another thing we need to look out for is the obvious shape. For example, on the plant on the left, you can see there's a branch which is sort of messing up the shape, and there's one on the right which is growing upright. That's clearly messing up the shape, and you want to keep a nice balanced even shape where you possibly can. The one on the right, again, we've got parallel branches, so look at which is the best one, which is the best height, which is going to serve you best overall, which has got the most fruit or whatever criteria you are evaluating them on, and remove the weaker one. Here you can see a weak branch which is sort of slightly withered or just hanging down. You would remove that. Crossing branches, obviously you're going to remove any crossing branches.
Count my 1, 2, 3, 4 outward facing bud, or actually go 5 because that's even more outward. Cut that above the bud, and on this one we've got a nice outward facing bud there. Cut that, so that's going to grow outwards, and that's simplified that. The one behind it will just prune them off as normal. So that it's just made that, you know, so they can fruit. So that's nice and straightforward. Let's have a look on this one. You can see on this one in behind here, that's going to grow up in the tree and jam into that. You don't want that. You've got a choice. You could have 4 buds and have a spur on it, or you could remove it. I'm just going to cut it back. I'm going to actually cut it back to a couple and hope that that will form a spur, and then I'll have some more fruit. On the one above it, again, we could simplify that just to cut that back and cut the ones above it back to 4 just to form spurs. Let's have a look at something just over the far side. So on this tree you can see the problem here, there's loads of what we call epicormic shoots. Shoots that are just flying up from the middle of the tree. And so with this, all you're going to do is remove all those epicormic shoots. So it's just a question of getting in there and removing all of them. I don't really want even the ones growing in, you know, you could spur prune them, but to be honest, you may as well remove all those and then you can move on to the next job. So that would be removing the epicormic shoots. On this one, it's what we've got here is a stub, and you don't really want a stub like that. It should have been pruned back to a branch, so this is just going to kind of die back. It's already, I can see the skin peeling off it a bit, and when the skin goes kind of wrinkly and it peels off, that's a sign of canker is already invading this tree, and so there's quite a bit of canker in this little orchard. So to remove that, if you didn't want to, you know, you could remove it in one, but it might rip back. So what we'll do here is we'll just remove the weight. So I'm just going to do a third from below, come slightly ahead of it and cut down. So what we're doing is just removing the weight off this one. And then what we can do is try to have a look what is the best angle. I think I'll have to come from below on this one to get a decent angle, and we'll cut that. And so that now hopefully has got a chance of healing. We'll need to burn this, as you can see. You can see how it's not in good condition and it's dying back, and I need to sanitize the saw now because of cross-contamination. So that's a problem on that particular tree. So that's removing the weight.